Before we kickstart the first speaker, just one housekeeping. For attendees who needs LAM CPD points, kindly sign out at the registration counter at the end of today. So, before we go on to the first speaker, let's take a look at our sponsor, Fasina's video. Now, let's get the ball rolling. Our first speaker, Nader, will dial in via Zoom. Nader had to make a last-minute presentation to the Museum Metropolitan of Art and cannot arrive on time for our conference. Before we start, let me first introduce Nader Tehrani from NADAAA, Boston. For his contribution to architecture as an art, Nader Tehrani is the recipient of the 2020 Arnold W. Brennan Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, to which he was also elected as a member in 2021, the highest form of recognition of artistic merit in the United States. He is founding principal of NADAAA and Dean of the Cooper Union's Irwin Chenin School of Architecture. His research focuses on the transformation of the building industry, innovative material applications, and the development of new means and methods of construction, especially through digital fabrication. Tehrani's work has received many prestigious awards, including the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award, and 18 Progressive Architecture Awards. Prior to becoming Dean at the Cooper Union, he taught at RSID, Harvard GSD, Georgia Institute of Technology, and MIT. Now, let us invite Nader to zoom in to this session.
Nader, you're going live.
Good morning, everyone. Is my voice coming through?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Can we have Nader on the screen? Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think we're running a little late, so if I go a little fast through some of the material, I don't think it'll alter the message. because I've organized the whole talk around several themes, and they cross through a variety of projects. The title is called Timely Anachronisms, in part because the allegorical figure that around which it revolves is the unmatched hare, who is essentially unmatched with its time due to global warming. But it's a vehicle for us to imagine that our discussion for building communities is not with each other, but with people who have yet to be born long after we are dead. And in turn, to build a dialogue with history, with architects and communities 200 years before us. So in some part, the themes that I'd like to speak to are the monomaterial ethic and the catalytic detail, how certain communities come out of technique and they are part of the craft of architecture, and how figurations and configurations produce part-to-whole reciprocities, whereby architecture is allowed to refer to itself and outside of itself at the same time. The tectonic grain establishes a rapport between architecture as artifice and nature. And then finally, we get to the actual social engagement about how the architect controls and collaborates at the same time, and then discuss political entanglements in the context of three pedagogical buildings. I've always been fascinated by the idea of monomateriality, to radicalize architecture through a catalytic detail, the singularity of a certain medium on the ground, on the walls, on the ceilings, pushing them to certain limits, as we can see in Leverance. In the rustication of the library walls of Plečnik, we can also see the way in which that stone migrates to the top of the building, allowing us to understand that the catalytic detail isn't an instance in the building, but in fact is its entirety. In the context of Casa La Roca, we imagined a situation in which we worked not so much with the running bond, nor the Flemish bond, but what we call the variable bond, that is able to slide on the horizontal axis and corbel at the same time. By doing so, we are able to not cut even one brick, but even more importantly, to allow for the passage of light and air into what is a structurally stable wall. Expanding on that theme, we realize that this can also become a vehicle through which program can get figured and formed. And so in the Tongxian Art Center, we're able to take on the requirements of water circulation, smoke, and physical circulation to envelop certain concrete masses, using the brick as formwork to give figurations to an otherwise abstract volume. In this case, the slope of the roof of the gatehouse is really indebted to the compression of the variable bond, tilting the entire facade in relationship to the roof, which propels out the water. In turn, that variable bond exposes itself for venting in this side or the turning of a corner on the other side. Obviously, the modularity of the brick, when transformed in scale to some other, becomes a totally different problem. In the context of CLT, or cross-laminated timber, we realize that the craft of the brick is here transformed into planks that are 8 feet by 30 feet in the context of the Connecticut house, producing a monolithic mass of CLT that acts as insulation on the outside, with a sister of balloon framing on the interior, precisely so that it can house all of the systems, be they HVAC, electrical, or otherwise. in a building that wastes absolutely no space. The circulation not only goes around the building, but gives rise to the poché spaces under and over the stairs, where bathrooms, bunk beds, closets, showers, and all of that take place. A building with no fat, as it were, allows for an interesting figuration of spaces within the context of the building. Here, the classical room oriented on one floor on the south, then east, then north, then west, is paired up with its sister of the circulation spaces that then have the bunk beds and all of the other features. Here, then, you can see the CLT on the left, and in the center, the thin laminar conditions of plywood around the studs. Within the context of this discussion, figurations and configurations hark big in this discussion. Essentially, the bowl and the nest are not two really different things. They're just theorized differently. The aggregate in the bowl is concealed, while the blades of grass and the twigs that are formed to make the nest show the relationship between parts. And our architecture most often occupies the right side of the scheme, where we start with the detail and end up forming different configurations as a consequence. Being fascinated by this passage of the Little Prince, we're also attendant to figuration, not only through how things look from the outside, but what the constitutions of the organs within the building are. There is an ethic in architecture that seeks, in some way or another, to understand how the infrastructure within the building may operate, and how that, in turn, may be separate from what happens outside of the building. Consider for a second the Palazzo Massimo in Rome, the way in which the symmetry on the outside belies the complexity and the organization of the intricate spaces on the inside. So here we'll inspect a series of systems that are skin systems that form a different kind of intelligence on their own terms, establishing a part-to-whole relationship. In the context of RISD, where we formed new urban connections from Brown University up to Woods Gary, North Hall produces a rather large mass, almost too large for its site. And for that, we established a skin system, a borrowing of the shingle roofs of its neighbors all around, using that system to scale in a completely new light the shingle systems, this time on the facade. The lapping of the shingles, though, are fashioned in a way to mirror exactly the action of the windows that they house. In fact, rotating out just like an awning, there's a kind of monomaterial, monomechanical sense to this facade. In turn, the massing of this building is then broken down into smaller portions such that the context can be melded into it. In the context of part-to-whole relationships, the skin is not always just a skin. It can also form a structural part. Here, in the Tenderun Bridge, for instance, connecting the Yarra River to the Tennis Open, we decided to work with rebar as a raw system, using the mechanics of bending and a kind of formational and foundational thing that one works with to figure out what is the maximum moment. But instead of having primary and tertiary members, begin to weave the rebar such that it forms both the longitudinal and the lateral strength of the bridge, wrapping around the railing, as it were, going under the underbelly and throughout the length of the building, up and over, and even establishing an extension for the lighting systems that speak to the silhouette of the city. This project seeks to imagine a framework of intricate trellis work that can become structural at the same time. In the context of the Daniels building, where we extend the Knox College towards the north, a lateral shingle system is adopted using thin slips to get northern light into the building. But herein lies a tectonic logic also, that some figuration is external to tectonics, as we see on the left side, but other forms of figuration are inherent to the way that brick works itself. And so this externality and internality can be witnessed in the context of the Weston House, as well as Casa La Roca, both referring back to the curtain, but also attendant to their own material conditions. Consider for a second the strength of corrugated copper on the longitudinal axis and its malleability on the horizontal. Here, you can see the way in which the ruled surface allows the line on the top of the building and the bottom of the corrugation to be identical. And once compressed, allows for a spatialization of that skin to insert a stair in there, connecting it, the living room down to the garden. This kind of figuration is all about the means and methods of different materials coming together. It can be done as much as on a facade as it can be done on a ground or on a ceiling. And in the ceilings that we've conceived here, in a pizza shop, here in a large dining hall, here in a restaurant, all of these are different systems of aggregation housing the organs of the building, mechanical systems, ducts, lighting systems, and so forth, that imagine a robust sixth elevation, a reflected ceiling plan, which tends to dominate contemporary architecture. Within that context, I would say that the ceiling at the Adams Library has a much more civic role and certainly plays a role in building community. The project harks back to a small community in Dorchester, just south of Boston, in which a single-story building is asked to play a civic function on the front, a monumental face, in turn breaking the volume down into smaller pieces in response to the residential scale of the houses behind, allowing all of the water to drain off into a rain garden in the back, carving southern light into the mass while framing a huge oak tree to the north. While the shelving systems in the three wings are organized north to south, the beams of the building, the reflected ceiling plan as it were, what I just presented, run east-west. And so the building comes together in a kind of organic fashion as one inhabits not only the roof as one looks down on it, but the ceiling as one travels through it in relationship to the outer garden, the outer reading. The monumental facade on the west end, the broken down facade on the east end, on the interior, the beams, the acoustic panels, the mechanical systems, the lighting, all exposed in their raw presence in a single pitch on one side and the broken down pitches of smaller programs on the opposite side. This technique is also adopted in Villa Varroise, essentially a landscape project, a house in southern France that works with the topography, a lower level in red and an upper level in green, coming together in the knot of a staircase that is essentially shrink-wrapped and gives form to an astonishing structural system that holds up the building. Indeed, in this case, the staircase is the structure and not just the circulatory membrane, allowing for the cantilever of the front facade to hold in place. So, conceptually, a courtyard building that is able to mutate in relationship to the primary view of the Mediterranean, the internalized view of the courtyard is slipped in relationship to the topography, allowing the terracing of the massing of the housing to gain access to these views. In turn, the tilting up of the roof allows western views, while the landscape tucks in and through the building, allowing the green not only to go under the building, but also on the green roof above. Here, built with formed concrete work, you can begin to see also the single slats of wood that form the concrete work in and of themselves. In this instance, the staircase and the roof speak to each other in figurative ways. Essentially, something like a case study house, just a glass volume. In fact, this is more like a Kimball Museum span, where the vaulting is running the longitudinal axis, allowing for the passage of light and air between the east and the west, framing the pine trees to the west and allowing the figure of the roof to have a structural function while producing a civic space within the context of the main living room. Now, within the context of these material conditions of figures and configurations, we witness the tectonic grain, where nature and artifice come in together in dialogue. Note the way in which, in Devil's Tower, the vertical surge of these tectonic elements is countercut by horizontal cuts when you see it up close. And indeed, architecture invariably is made up of broken down pieces. The grain of wood is one thing on the one hand, but the way we cut the wood is another. So consider the board and batten system, for instance, of the rural New England house, and how that is able to hide all of the doors into the garage. But opting not to put other hardware onto the building, in this instance, we're able to take the part, the handle that is, and unwind it from the batten system of the board and batten system to allow for that passage. That is part of the idea of the tectonic grain. In the context of concrete, on the other hand, that grain is formed either by formwork or by bush hammering, what is done afterwards. The liquid that is the constitution of the concrete doesn't produce the grain in itself. Of course, there are many who've experimented with this, historical and contemporary, from Fisac to Cutlass. But we tested two techniques on Villa Barroise. One was the fabric form technique, where the smooth conditions of concrete give way to the rustication of large boulders as a representation. And not being completely happy with that, we opted for a technique that we witnessed Frank Lloyd Wright taking on, where the aggregate plays the animate form of expressing the building itself. In this instance, the smooth walls of the interior allow for the hand to touch them for paintings and so forth, but then the aggregate of the outside growing in scale such that there's an inversion between the figure ground of the stone and the mortar, such that it becomes just a generic stone wall within the context of the French landscape. Indeed, like many of our projects, some things don't always happen. And so by forcing it to be built out of wood, what we did instead is that we sandblasted the wood to such a degree that, in combination with the warm earth aggregate that is part of the soil of the territory, the house looks more like wood than it does concrete. This idea of establishing a rapport between the structure and the skin becomes something that we play out in the Venice Biennale. Indeed, here, working with cross-laminated timber, we imagined what it would mean to cantilever a single plank of cross-laminated timber in two directions and carving that grain out of the logic of CLT. The sandwiching of the cross-laminated timber, almost like plywood, the routing of one layer after the other, thus the thin parts cantilever out to a thin deck, the penetration of the moments in which allow the columns to penetrate, and the neighboring pieces that nest into the sides of the canopy. Here, the patterning of the surface and the structural logic of the cantilever work in tandem. Now, working in RISD, back at the RISD dorms, we also witness another portion of the building that harks back to the tradition of masonry construction. The brick that is so representative of that context finds its way into the base of the building and onto the south facade of the northern dorms, albeit as a veneer system. So one of the challenges was how do you make a masonry system that's so thin appear as if it's constitutionally fat and that it has weight and density. And so in the context of the loggia that suspends the connection between the old and the new, indeed we have these massive pylons. But as we go around the building towards the south and the brick plays a role to retain the earth, it also corbels in and out and in and out in precast panels, allowing for that tectonic grain to emerge from the constitution of the brick itself. Note here that it's not only the brick that has a kind of tectonic grain, but as the slate comes to its ending, the thinness of that veneer system is seen on the end grain of the top of the building, and indeed forms a dialogue with its context too. This is not completely dissimilar from the MIT project also running north-south that has a distinct side panel system that conceal a moment truss that supports the entire building, panelized in anodized aluminum work that uses a gradient from dark to light to produce the illusion of great height where there is none. Here, the core of the building houses all of the systems so that all of the rooms can maximize best views, and the structure is then woven in between the slipped panels, all coming together on a south bay that is more transparent and a north bay that is more insulated. Here you can see the south and the figure of the building being the result of the configuration of its structural panels, and on the north, the pilaster systems that intricately articulate the membrane on the north as it addresses Main Street. Now, the idea of the tectonic grain, of course, harks back to nature. For instance, the striping of the zebra as it finds a way to conceal itself within the savanna. But anybody who knows nature also knows that this is not correct, because the actual tectonic grain of zebras runs perpendicular not only to the torso, but also of the legs. But the architect's task most often than not is one of building these grains. What we do is artificial, and we have to be attendant to the means and methods of how we do these things. Sometimes we do them through our own means, but very often we do them through techniques of others. In the context of social engagement, our control and our collaboration becomes revealed in the way that we work with and collaborate with weavers, potters, and people that have greater knowledge about areas of urbanism and architecture that is not attendant to our work. In the context of Rikers Island, much of the work of social justice was done not by architecture, but really in collaboration with legal experts, social workers, families, policemen, and a range of people who had already been incarcerated to redistribute an idea about social justice. In the context of art, we've collaborated with Adam Silverman to produce an installation for the Nasher Museum that probes the way in which his earth, the ceramic, the terracotta that he's working with, comes from soils and areas where artillery have been placed and the earth is contaminated. Working with the figure of the bullet, as it were, truncated to produce different configurations, our collaboration with him allowed this installation to essentially move around into different configurations at any given time, with his craft really as the foundation of that work. In the context of our collaboration with Raya Kassieh, we worked with her technique of weaving and crocheting, looking at local crafts to build certain units that together, when woven together, can be strung into the warehouse of the Amman Design Month, and in turn gain a kind of spatial quality once they're inside. But much like other biennales and events like this, we did not want the material to go to waste. So when we took it apart, we understood that the dimensions around which we had to design needed to be functional in the context of the blankets that they would eventually become, in order to provide for the Syrian refugees that were its end goal, essentially. In the context of urbanism, social engagement takes on a far larger process. Here, in the context of the Daniels Building in Toronto, we're engaging historic preservation, looking at Knox College, a neo-Gothic building with a spire on its southern side, something to be preserved, indeed enhanced, such that the addition that we make into the north of the studios are not so much conceived of as a building, but rather as a landscape that, almost like an octopus, spills out and grows out in order to reveal the spire intact from the northern face. In fact, if the main facades of the Daniels Building are on the north and on the south, the actual access into the building is east-west. And one of the huge coups d'etats of this building was that we were able to enter a street into it that is open 24/7. Indeed, the entry to the actual program happens above that level. And so the street that we produce within the context of this building houses all of its public facilities accessible to the public. The Fab Lab, the auditorium, the cafe. But then, as one goes through it, one gets peeks into the studio spaces above, into the Fab Lab below, and indeed realizes that this is part of its urban engagement, inviting the community not only to come inside, but also to be able to work in the building from the outside. The urban connections, the courtyard on the outside, all of these create a porous building that invites the building from many sides in and out. So though a very volumetric building, nonetheless a landscape building. In the context of the Adams Library, that kind of social engagement was even frustrating in the sense that we could not design the building. We had to design it in collaboration with the community, the elderly, the adolescents, the children, the library community, all the while knowing that the plan of the library, unfortunately, is panoptic because of its security control systems, but also something that allows for public space on the outside. Indeed, carving the garden on the outside is a central part of how this building operates, using the transparency between the inside and the out to moderate light, but also to create public spaces on the outside. Indeed, the oak tree that is at the corner of the building forms the canopy of the outdoor reading room, a major civic space that is open for the community even when the library is closed. And so this is the contribution back to the community as we articulate different ways it can be used for different political events and so forth. In the Biennale in Shenzhen, we were tasked to do another temporary pavilion, but we asked them what happens if this stays longer and actually serves the urban functions that the community actually needs. So working with scaffolding, we developed an elegant structure that through its rotation allows for a space of inhabitation and not just a billboard. And aside from the opening events of the Biennale itself, this allowed that structure to stay on and serve as the canopy for the coffee house and the public markets that essentially happen on a weekly basis within the context of that community. Sometimes the community and the civic realm don't happen in the center of the town as one expects. In this case, what we were given is a peripheral condition because the center was occupied by an electrical plant. And so the public space of the community happens on the edge of this condition where colored precast concrete members establish a kind of radiant series of colored conditions that mirror the landscape and the programs surrounding the site. So all of this then concludes in the context of political entanglements and pedagogical buildings and how they come together. And some of them come in the context of the means and methods because architects can only designate design intent, but not exactly how they're built. And other times it has to do with the way in which public projects become entangled by processes that the architect can no longer control. Here, in the context of MIT, we also won the commission for the gateway that is not only connected to the campus, but also to the MBTA systems and the subway systems, essentially making for an entry into the MIT campus. While all of the elements that connect to the subway system are grounded, a tall canopy system of 25 feet plus straddles the top of this, allowing for the passage of the public to come in and through the building. And fabricated here, just last week, delivered to the site on the Charles River. This is a project that is being clad as we speak. here a shot from yesterday where the gateway will be opened in about a month or so. The idea of urbanism and in the context of political entanglements is core. Here, at the core of the Melbourne School of Design, we were tasked to build essentially a building, an architecture building with a studio on top of it. They never had dedicated studios. Indeed, we came to understand that as a matte building, the building had the prospects of a huge public space within its core that responded to the neo-Georgian courts of the exterior of the campus, and that core of that building would serve a vital thing within the context of this building. But the challenge of the building really occurred within a political context of the studio being canceled. And because it was canceled, the architects, we had to develop a way in which we would maintain that program, not horizontally, but possibly vertically, robbing an extra space off of the corridor to make committed spaces of studio within the context of circulation, and then borrowing classroom and research space for when the studios needed to expand. Then taking the budget of the railing of the atrium and putting them back into the FF&E budget to produce collaborative desks, drafting boards, and crit areas that all come together in the context of a vertical studio hall. In the context of the Daniels building that you saw just earlier, the studio hall was also about to get canceled, essentially with the contractors telling us that our forms are unbuildable. And when we showed them the work of Felix Candela and the ruled surfaces of shell concrete work, they simply said it was too expensive and $1 million over. And so part of our political engagement is also to build. In the context of our own studio space, building a stick version of that concrete, we were allowed to insert also radiant panels within the chipboard, bringing the budget down $800,000 in a ruled surface that is built up by essentially steel members plastered over with the heating system on the inside. And of course, all of that connecting back to the auditorium that you saw earlier and the studio space and the space of Spadina building. The pedagogical building is at the center of what you and I do, in the sense that when we build schools of architecture, we're not just building spaces of learning, but by virtue of what we do, we have a literate audience. And so all of the details become didactic in their function. And so that is really how the three schools of architecture evolved for us. In Georgia Tech, even though it was a renovation of an existing space, we were tasked with making a flexible space. And part of that flexibility in our minds was given to the idea that we could develop a floor system of electrical hookups, but that nothing else touched the ground. Everything was suspended from above. In other words, the truss and the gantry crane from above let the desks underneath be real free. If you wanted to empty them out for large constructions, you could. And then the crib for added studio space, the second means of egress, and the lighting all get suspended from above, allowing for the kind of flexibility that a space like this needed. A very, very low budget. The project even ran out of budget when we were polishing the existing sign of the building, where we transformed the research building into an architecture building. Back to the Melbourne School of Design, the center studio space is the key space in and of itself. The roof comes to confluence with a dedicated studio space that is suspended in the middle, iconic, much like many of its predecessors, it diverges from them by essentially bringing the roof and the spaces of that structure into confluence. Spanning 22 meters from side to side, the depth of this structure is over 3 meters also, rotated to the side so that you get natural light but never direct sun. From that, a massive system of spatialized wood frames spaces of studio, becoming thinner and thinner as it goes down the surface and suspends above the public space of the courtyard within. Now, it's important to remember that this is an inversion of the classical system of rustication, whereby rustication is massive at the base and thin at the top. We're using massive members at the top and thin plywood at its base. At the top, indeed, you occupy the massive space. You are in the truss itself, but underneath it, you witness the acoustic panels and the baffles that, in a way, articulate the acoustic environment of the spaces in between. Built almost entirely off-site, prefabricated, everything of this project was delivered in the wee hours of the morning to produce what is an interior space which was destined to become an ideal spaces for interdisciplinary communities between architecture, landscape, urbanism, and planning. So successful is that spaces that all of the entire university is using it, much to the dismay of the designers within the building, who often can't get seats within the context of the atrium when it's fully occupied. With that, I thank you so much, and it's been a great pleasure to be part of this event.
A round of applause for Nader Tehrani. I would like my colleague Nick to share the screen of the audience so that we can say a big hi and wave your hands to Nader. Just pause for a second until the screen is up. Nick, can we do that now? All right. So let's all wave a big hi to Nader. And a very good evening to you. Thank you. All right, a big round of applause again for Nader Tehrani. Thank you.